Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Alfonso Peluso and I'm a Studio Associate Professor in the College of Architecture at IIT, the home of the legendary Mies van der Rohe. Today is actually Mies's birthday. If he was alive, I think he'd be 135. I am also adjunct faculty at Columbia College in Chicago in the Interior Architecture program. Shout out to all of my students. I hope everyone is doing well today. I'm doing fantastic. It is spring in Chicago, so it's starting to warm up. The grass is starting to get green. Pretty soon we'll have some leaves on the trees. That's going to be awesome. Today we are going to look at a plugin for Grasshopper called IntraLattice. And what you see on my screen here is a pretty complex lattice, and it's actually a good lattice for 3D printing. It doesn't have any naked edges, so you can 3D print it. And what it is, if I show, there are two surfaces, and these purposefully are pretty complex surfaces that I've created here in Rhino, and I'm spanning a lattice between those two surfaces. So we're going to look at how to do that and much more. Alright, before we jump into the tutorial, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and subscribe. I am so close, about 50 subscribers, and I'll be at 8,000. So that's a pretty nice milestone to hit. So go ahead and subscribe to me on YouTube and connect with me on Instagram. See what I'm up to with my students. They're doing some really great work this semester, and you can see a lot of that on the page. It's great connecting with everyone and creating this community. Alright, IntraLattice. So you can find IntraLattice on Food for Rhino. If you search for IntraLattice, you'll find the download on Food for Rhino. And they also have a website at intralattice.com. So both of those places you can find information on IntraLattice. Now, one example that comes to mind for me is we're seeing a lot of 3D printed footwear these days. And if you look at the soles of these shoes, you can see something similar to what I had just shown in Rhino and Grasshopper. So you could imagine this being a surface on the top and this being a surface on the bottom, and then spanning an intralattice or a lattice between those two surfaces. So we're going to look at how to do that. Alright, let's get into it. Okay, I will get rid of this for now. Okay, let's get started. So what we start with is we start with a preset cell. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that onto the canvas. And you'll see a little cell here at the origin, and I can change that cell. So to change that cell, I can forward through these, but I think it's easier, especially if you haven't used the software before, to go ahead and right click on this input slider and go down. You can choose checklist, drop down, value sequence, or value cycle. I like the drop down list because then I can drop it down and I can see everything, all the preset cells. So we have those preset cells, and we can apply it to what the creator of this plugin calls a design space. So under frame, we have many design spaces, and today we're going to look at a basic box just to get an understanding of how this plugin works, and then we're going to look at the conform surface to surface. Okay, so this basic box, I'm going to go ahead and drop that in, and I'm going to plug topology into topology, and I get this larger box here. So there's a lot of adjustments that can be made to this box. You can change the cell size in the XYZ, and you can change the number of cells in the XYZ. Okay, from that we can turn this into a mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab Homogen, and this is just going to be a continuous size mesh. So I'm going to plug that in the struts, and then I need struts in the struts, and then I need a radius. So I'm going to make my radius for this. I'm going to make it 1.555 just to get some decimal places, just kind of a random number there. And I let that generate. Tough to see it. This software has, I love this icon, this like hamburger icon. It has a mesh preview. I can plug that in and I can get a preview of that mesh. I can also use my standard custom preview, and I can drop that in. And if I hide this one, there I get a little color in my mesh. Alright, and not the fastest software. I mean, it does take a little while to generate this, but you see I'm moving that number slider down. Okay. Alright, so that is a continuous size strut. So all the struts are the same size. So there's a couple different gradients in here. So let me just move some of this over, and I'll pick this up. Okay, so the next one we'll look at is we're going to look at the heterogen gradient. So I'm going to drop that in, and I'm going to plug my struts into struts. I'm going to go ahead and disable this other one. This first one that we made. Oh, where is the enable? Let me try this again. There it is. Okay. And I'm going to plug this in just to get this going here. We won't use this one anymore. Okay, so it is looking for a gradient string, a maximum radius, and a minimum radius. So it has some defaults plugged in. The maximum radius is 0.5 and the minimum radius is 0.2. So let's get some number sliders. So 0.200, I'm just going to use what that default was. And then for the maximum, I'm going to put in 2.00. Okay, so no gradient yet. It's still looking for an input for the gradient string. So let me just give myself a little bit of space here. Okay, so I can get this gradient string. If I go to utilities, I can choose a preset gradient. And a little more space is needed. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's get this plugged in. Okay, so here you see a gradient from, it's pretty exaggerated, from 0.2 all the way up to 2. And right now that gradient is in the x direction, so it's going from left to right. And I can change that to the y. I can change that to the z. I can center it on the x, so you get the small spacing in the middle. I can center it in the y, and I can center it in the z. And cylindrical and spherical, those have to do with the different design spaces. So the design spaces are under frame. So there's a basic cylinder here, and there's also a uniform, which is a uniform design space, which works with a B-rep. Okay, alright, so let's look at setting up a custom gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and disable that. And I'm going to go here to mesh, and I'm going to turn on heterogen custom. Okay, and I'm going to plug that into struts. Okay, so this needs some more information. If I zoom in, it's looking for the start radii and the end radii. So it wants those values. Now, in the gradient, not the gradient custom, I was able to just plug in some values. Okay, this gives me an error when I plug in the start radii and the end radii because it says number of radii in each list must have the same number. Okay, number of radii in each list must have the same number. Number of elements as the struts list. So that's important. So when I clicked on that, it was number of radii in each list must have the same number of elements as the struts list. So we need to do this a little bit differently. So let me step back here, move this stuff out of the way, see if I can get all that. Yep. Okay. Clean this up a little bit more. Okay, so how many struts are coming out of here? There's 540. So if I use a list length, I can plug my struts into that, and that gives me 540. So I'm going to do this by creating a range of values. And a range needs a few things. It needs a domain, and it needs the number of steps. Number of steps are the number of values. We can get that from the list length. Okay, now I'm going to set up my domain. So I'm going to use a construct domain. And I'm going to use the values, the domain start. I'm going to use this small value, this 0.2. And I'm going to use this larger value for the domain end, which is 2. Okay. And I'm getting 541 values. So coming out of the struts, 540. Coming out of the range, 541. So the range adds one value. So I'm going to right click on the amount of steps. I'm going to go to expression, and I'm going to make this x minus 1. Okay, now I have 540 values. So that's going to be my start radius. And then I'm going to take this all, copy and paste it, and this is going to be my end radius. Okay, and I'm going to change some of these values around too. Okay, so what do we have here? Let's take a look at it. Okay, so very similar to a linear x gradient at the moment. So if I make this, let's say I make this 0.5, and then I make this 0.5. So I'm going from, in theory, I'm going from 0.2 to 0.5, and then from 0.5 to 2. Okay, so you get this funny looking thing happening here in, you see that in being displayed in Rhino. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little graph mapper to this. It's because this is a custom gradient is what we want, and right now we don't have a custom gradient. So I'm going to add a graph mapper. Okay, I'm going to plug that in. Let's give some space here. Okay, so I'm going to plug the graph mapper into the start radius. I'm going to right click on this graph mapper, and I'm going to go down to graph types, and I'm going to change this to Gaussian. Okay, and what I need to do with the graph mapper is I need to set the domain equal to this domain here on the left, so 0.2 to 0.5. So I'm going to double click on that, 0.2 to 0.5, And this is a two-directional domain. So that's the x, minimum and max, 0.2 to 0.5, and then the y, minimum and max, 0.2 to 0.5. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the end radii. Okay, so I'm going to take this graph, copy and paste it, plug in this bottom range value, plug this into the end radii. Okay. And I'm going to change this domain now to match what's happening here on the left. So 0.5 to 2. So double click on it. So this is 0.5 to 2. And then 0.5 to 2 in the x and the y. Okay, so now what you're seeing is these larger values are happening in the middle, like the grid is showing here. So the way that this grid works is the larger values are in the middle. So it's a Gaussian. So it starts out small, gets big, and gets small again. So it's like a bell curve. So I can start to move this, and you see that gradient is moving as well. So lots of little different things that you can do here with these grids. This is just, so remember, this is the min radius here that's moving around, and the max radius here is moving around. Alright, that's pretty cool. Alright, so let's get to the juicy part of it, which is conforming a lattice between two surfaces. Now, one thing that I haven't done in here is I haven't gone back to this value list, and I think that's important before we move on. So this value list, right now we're just looking at a grid, but I can go from a grid to an X. Okay, so we're getting some cooler stuff happening there. I can go from an X to a star. It takes us a couple seconds to generate it. And I can go to a cross. I won't go through all of them. Let's see what the cross looks like. That's pretty wild. That's starting to look recording. Alright, so one other thing that I didn't show here is how good is the mesh. So if I go to mesh report, I can put that down there, and I can go to mesh report, and I can add a panel. And this one is saying the mesh is invalid, so that's something that we want to look at. So maybe if I change this back to X, let's see what happens. It might not like my little gradient that I have in there. Still mesh is invalid, so it's not digging my gradient, so that needs to be adjusted. So just keep that in mind. It's not, it's not magic. It's not, you can't do everything you want in the plugin, I should say. So you want to be keeping an eye on what it says here. So I have some naked edges in this one. Okay, let's keep going here. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and hide this one, or disable it. Okay. And I'm going to hide everything that's here. Okay, so in Rhino, if I type in show, here's my two surfaces. So pretty complex surfaces. And I did that on purpose. I always like to break these plugins and see what they can handle. And there's some things that it can't handle, and we'll see that in a second. So if I go back to IntraLattice here, and I'm going to start with my preset cell. Okay, and for my design space, I'm going to use conform surface to surface. So I'm going to plug in my topology here. I have to bring these two surfaces from Rhino into Grasshopper, so I'm going to use a surface container. and another one. And I'll go ahead and set this. And I'll go ahead and plug these in. So it has U, V, W, and it has a morph. So what the morph will do, you see the lines are straight at the moment. If I go to and add a Boolean toggle, I can plug that in, and I can double click on that and change it to true, and now it does the curved lines. Okay, so I've noticed some issues that it has with the curved lines. So we're going to look at that. So let's just make this, let's go ahead and make this a homogen mesh. So that's just a continuous radii. Let's make the radii 0.5. I've had some errors with the size of that, if it's too big. Okay, so that one it's able to make. Let's go ahead and change that grid. Okay, so that's the X grid. Make this a drop-down list. So it's a little bit too large right now. I'm going to go ahead and add a custom preview. Okay, so we're seeing that. Go ahead and turn off all this stuff. Okay, I'll hide my surfaces. Hide this bottom one. Okay, so now we're getting something like the gym shoe there. Okay, I've noticed with this that if I try to morph this, let's give it a second to think about it. I get some errors with that. So right now nothing's showing. So I think it has something to do with the thickness is one part of it. But even if I make this say 0.2, it's thinking. Okay, so you see what happened there. Let's get Grasshopper to come back up. Didn't like that at all. So see some issues there. So not perfect. I wish it was. If I can get my Grasshopper window to show back up, that would be awesome. There it is. Okay. So having some problems with the morph. Let's take that morph off. Okay. So this is looking pretty good. Let's see what kind of mesh it is. So let's go to our mesh report. I love that mesh report. Let's go to the mesh report and let's add a panel. Alright, so that's a valid mesh. That's why I didn't really want to mess around with that other one too much, because I knew, well, I didn't know. I was hopeful that this one would be valid. Let's add some thickness to this. Alright. Alright, there you have it. IntraLattice. Alright, we covered everything here. So you're going to see my head pop up. And if you haven't subscribed, click on my head and you can subscribe. Leave me a like. Tell me why you like this video. You'll see some other links to videos pop up in the upper right and the lower right. Thank you for watching. I will see you on the next one.